The purpose of this presentation is to update Indigenous mothers on issues related to genocide that have arisen since June of 2021 in Canada. Presentation is prepared by Tohahoga, who is Satigari Wite Runo Akwajire, a turtle clan from the Mohawk people at Oswego. We are reminding all our relations that we are all in agreement about what time and place and time and space that we're at. And this is marked by the calendar that was created in Chichen Itza a long time ago that documented that we would be entering into an era of 9 hells, and that each of the 9 terraces on the Chichen Itza calendar are actually years, and that there are 52 steps on each of the terraces for 468 years. We also know, and we hear from our Anishinaabe friends, that the time of the 7th fire is upon us, and that we're moving into the era of the 8th fire that we're hearing now, people talking about. We also know in the South, our relatives in the South talk about the time of the 6th sun. And in the Southwest, where they have said 40,000 years ago, the real human beings emerged into the 4th world and migrated to the 4 directions. Up to this present time, we're moving into the 5th world. Our people here at Oswego talk about the great swamp elm. And the great swamp elm is a birthing medicine that is prepared for women who are in their last trimester before they have a baby. But this is related to a time when the real human beings gather by the roots of the great swamp elm and recover the old one's knowledge about living without fossil fuel and electricity. But after this period of time, the change comes to Mother Earth when her water breaks, which we can see right now with global warming melting the ice caps and the increase in water everywhere on Earth. This is a reminder of how things came to be the way they are and the way they're talking about as our people have gone out and begin to communicate with the outside world. We know about such things as the intergenerational transmission of trauma that begins with violence that is transmitted from generation to generation. We also know that the loss of our cultures and our heritage has resulted in a period of grief, and that has been resolved. And many people are working today on healing the unresolved grief. But there are those that see that our pain and our grief and our misery and our trauma are actually a commodity that needs to be used so that we can participate in the economies of the modern world. And this has resulted in a period where we have many hurt people who are working to heal hurt people. And that hurts those hurt people, as we're finding out. Over the years, it's been estimated that there are between 60 and 30,000 children who died in the schools. 6,000 to 30,000 children who have died in the residential schools. As of October 21, the unconfirmed death rate is 7,310 children. This presentation comes out of the events that happened in June 2021 when there were a discovery of 215 graves at the Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia on the west coast of the Canadian continent. This relates to also events that happened over the last few years with people who had participated in the Mohawk Institute and bringing light to what happened in those schools that began in earnest in the 1980s. So the purpose of this presentation is then to mark what's happened at the Kamloops School in June of 2021, but also the idea that a crime many Indigenous people know all too well was committed by Canada, that was the forcibly transfer of children, as was stated by John A. Macdonald, who said that it would be a good thing to do to transfer children from their parents to schools. We also know that there are around 139 Indian residential schools continent-wide under Canadian education policy that closed in the 1990s. We expect that all have graveyards. Beginning with John A. Macdonald, the first prime minister in the 1880s, they began a period of war against Native people that also included then the statements about killing the Indian in the child that was part of John A. Macdonald's legacy, where he said, when the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents who are savages. Though he may learn to read and write, he is simply a savage who can read and write, and children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence. And that's where the Indian Residential School program began in earnest under John A. Macdonald. It continued under Prime Minister Laurier, and Wilfrid Laurier ignored warnings from Dr. Peter Bryce about deaths from disease among children in the schools. This is Laurier who created many of the principles that were to become the Indian termination policy in Canada. And this was fulfilled later on by the Superintendent of Indian Affairs, infamously known as Duncan Campbell Scott, who says that the object of the legislation is to continue until there's not a single Indian who has not been absorbed into the body of Canada, and there's no more Indian question. And they coined the phrase killing the Indian in the child, which was correspondent with the phrase killing the Indian in the man in the United States, where Duncan Campbell Scott worked with American lawyer Arthur J. Ludington in forming what they called Indian termination. This is in brief what happened over the years with the main Indigenous law systems that existed across the continent. The potlatch, or pot-shot, was overthrown and outlawed by Canada under Laurier. And in the 1800s, it is well known that leaders over there were assassinated and the potlatch was outlawed. The Sundance was also outlawed in Canada under John A. Macdonald, who also created the Indian Wars. At the same time, the Indian Wars were being fought in the United States. And Louis Riel, a leader of a party of people in Manitoba, was assassinated. And Duncan Campbell Scott urged Indian agents to completely disrupt ceremonies, and people say that they could be arrested as late as the 1940s for participating in the Sundance. The Iroquois Confederacy, or the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy, as it was known in the Red Man's Appeal for Justice, was overthrown in 1924, but this was after 5 epidemics swept through Six Nations from 1901 to 1919. And the overthrow, or the coup d'etat, of all the law systems was created in the early 1900s in Canada. All of that history precedes what happened in June 11th, 2008, when Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper reiterated in a different way a lot of what happened in Canada in the famous Apology for Indian Residential Schools of 2008, where, as is quoted in the record of the meeting, they apologized for using the term killing the Indian in the child. They also apologized to those who died waiting for the apology. They also stated clearly, you were powerless to protect your own children, and for this we are sorry. Added with the confirmation, God bless all of you and God bless our land. Directly taken from the Hansard, which is the minutes of the Parliament meetings in Canada, the statements were clear that the mission of forcibly transferring children and placing them in the schools caused serious bodily and mental harm. There's such a thing in diplomacy as called an affective speech act, which is a speech act that is performed, that expresses emotions and values and beliefs, but where there is an opposite intent from what is stated. The purpose is to infer innocence or blamelessness by whoever performed an act that is being talked about by the Affective Speech Act. And this could be related to what we would say about the Apology for Indian Residential Schools. So here's the quote. Not only did you suffer abuses as children, but as you became parents, you were powerless to protect your own children from suffering the same experience. And for this, we are sorry, as was stated in the apology of 2008. But in other words, how we would translate that into an effective speech act is this: we're sorry you couldn't keep your kids from us. In particular, as we now move into a statement of the reference to the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, we relate directly to Article 2, which says that there are 5 acts that they considered to be genocide, but that the convention means acts that are committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group of people. As such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and lastly, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Article 2 relates to those who should be punishable by those acts listed in Article 2. And it says that genocide is the act that shall be punishable with intent to commit genocide. B, conspiracy to commit genocide, and complicity in genocide. Conspiracy means working with other groups to then forcibly transfer those children, or the act that was accomplished, or poison the water, and so on and so on. Complicity can mean just watching it happen and doing nothing about it. In our case, years ago, after they began talking about the Indian Residential School, some elders came to young people and said that they wanted instructions on how to pursue the state of Canada on the crime of genocide. And this is among a group of people that live about 100 kilometers south of Toronto, Canada, along a country called the Grand River, where they have been living for over 200 years, having been forcibly removed and relocated from their homelands in the United States. And the rationale for deciding, as it was explained to the elders, what it meant in all of the Article 2 clauses about genocide, killing members of the group, that has now been identified in the Indian Residential School graveyards, but recently recorded in the inquiry report on murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls in Canada that was completed in 2019. Causing serious or bodily or mental harm, which we see in the statistics across the whole continent right now. Highest suicide rates, incarceration rates, murders, addictions, and misdiagnosis and malpractice that has been committed continent-wide in this country. And we know that the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and men are a distinct number of around perhaps 4,000 people altogether. But this is a tip of an underwater volcano of malpractice and misdiagnosis that's occurred across the whole country, where people are mystified by what happened to their relatives when they went into the hospital and didn't come out. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole in part through pollution. Many lands are polluted, and because many of our people live along rivers, we have a high incidence of cancer, scleroderma, miscarriages, neurological and circulatory diseases that are the highest continent-wide in the whole country. And mostly this is created by poor living conditions and environmental conditions near the places where our people live. Measures intended to prevent births has been documented recently in the idea of uninformed consent and eugenics programs where women have been sterilized, but also related to the environmental conditions that have been seen in the miscarriages and, of course, the murders of women that was identified in the inquiry for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. And with a focus on what was asked after our talk about the Indian residential schools, forcibly transferring children to residential schools that has continued in the 60s scoop, where children were forcibly transferred from their families to outside families, which is also described as legislated child custody. The rationale for the claim of complicity means taking Canada's words to heart as to what they said. And Canada said, treatment of children was a sad chapter in the story to kill the Indian and the child. Clearly, Canada admitted to the present day complicity in genocide and conspiracy to commit genocide. The basis of our claim is that the government of Canada admitted that their actions caused great harm, has had a lasting and damaging impact, and we apologize for having done this. The last school closed in the 1990s, but the idea that it had a lasting and damaging effect was an admission by Canada that the crime of genocide story exists to the present day. That is why then, under the direction of the elders, a letter was written to the Organization of American States. And the reason why the OAS was contacted was because they invested Canada after the report was released on the inquiry for murdered and missing Indigenous women. But there was also a reluctance to even use the word genocide in Canada. For example, in the criticism of China's treatment of the Uyghurs in West China, they said that more evidence from an investigation was needed. And the response in the world was that these countries, China, Russia, Belarus, Iran, North Korea, Syria, and Venezuela, then asked for the independent investigation from the UN on Canada's genocide. So a letter was sent on June 2nd to the Organization of American States asking for some advice and some guidance on how to proceed with a claim. And the request was received on June 7th and forwarded into their system. And then a response came from them in August when the petition and case system for the IACHR was received in August 20th. And this report of the response by the OAS was presented to a clan meeting in October 3rd, 2021. And at the clan meeting, there was no objection to presenting the information to a wider audience or a wider group network of Indigenous women. So the purpose of this presentation was to get some indication from Indigenous women of the Americas. What do you think? And the purpose then would be to say that Indigenous women networking and talking together would find out some ideas about what you want to do about what you've just heard about. Always mindful now of where we started off with the 9 hells that was depicted in the pyramid at Chichen Itza, the time of the great swamp elm, the time of the 6th sun, the time of the 5th world, and the time of the 7th fire. Because surviving genocide means that we would then look for ways that we will network together to live into the time of what was foretold by the Mayas way back when. After the 9 hells, events would take place on Earth that would bring changes to the Earth, when we would need to live and recover the old ones' knowledge about how to live without hydroelectricity, and fossil fuel, entering into an era of the time of 13 heavens, or 1,000 years of peace, as is also said, followed by which there will be an emergence into the fifth world once again. Thank you for your kind attention to this presentation on the crime is genocide that has been committed against Indigenous people.